produced in this connection. Another work of no little merit has been produced by the same writer, on the supremacy of reason, which some have called Maccabeicum, because it contains an account of the struggles of those Hebrews who contended manfully for the true religion, as is related in the books called Maccabees. And at the end of the 20th book of his Antiquities, Josephus himself intimates that he had purposed to write a work in 4 books concerning God and his existence, according to the traditional opinions of the Jews, and also concerning the laws, why it is that they permit some things while prohibiting others. And the same writer also mentions in his own works other books written by himself. In addition to these things, it is proper to quote also the words that are found at the close of his Antiquities, in confirmation of the testimony which we have drawn from his accounts. In that place he attacks Justus of Tiberias, who, like himself, had attempted to write a history of contemporary events, on the ground that he had not written truthfully. Having brought many other accusations against the man, he continues in these words: I indeed was not afraid in respect to my writings as you were, but, on the contrary, I presented my books to the emperors themselves when the events were almost under men's eyes. For I was conscious that I had preserved the truth in my account, and hence was not disappointed in my expectation of obtaining their attestation. And I presented my history also to many others, some of whom were present at the war, as for instance King Agrippa and some of his relatives. For the Emperor Titus desired so much that the knowledge of the events should be communicated to men by my history alone, that he endorsed the books with his own hand, and commanded that they should be published. And King Agrippa wrote 62 epistles testifying to the truthfulness of my account. Of these epistles Josephus subjoins 2. But this will suffice in regard to him. Let us now proceed with our history. Chapter 11. Simeon rules the Church of Jerusalem after James. After the martyrdom of James and the conquest of Jerusalem which immediately followed, it is said that those of the apostles and disciples of the Lord that were still living came together from all directions with those that were related to the Lord according to the flesh, for the majority of them also were still alive, to take counsel as to who was worthy to succeed James. They all with one consent pronounced Simeon, the son of Clopas, of whom the Gospel also makes mention, to be worthy of the episcopal throne of that parish. He was a cousin, as they say, of the Saviour. For Hegesippus records that Clopas was a brother of Joseph. Chapter 12. Vespasian commands the descendants of David to be sought. He also relates that Vespasian, after the conquest of Jerusalem, gave orders that all that belonged to the lineage of David should be sought out, in order that none of the royal race might be left among the Jews. And in consequence of this a most terrible persecution again hung over the Jews. Chapter 13. Anacletus, the second bishop of Rome. After Vespasian had reigned 10 years, Titus, his son, succeeded him. In the 2nd year of his reign Linus, who had been bishop of the Church of Rome for 12 years, delivered his office to Anacletus. But Titus was succeeded by his brother Domitian, after he had reigned 2 years and the same number of months. Chapter 14. Abilius, the second bishop of Alexandria. In the 4th year of Domitian, Anianus, the first bishop of the parish of Alexandria, died after holding office 22 years, and was succeeded by Abilius, the second bishop. Chapter 15. Clement, the third bishop of Rome. In the 12th year of the same reign, Clement succeeded Anacletus, after the latter had been bishop of the Church of Rome for 12 years. The Apostle, in his epistle to the Philippians, informs us that this Clement was his fellow worker. His words are as follows: "With Clement and the rest of my fellow laborers, whose names are in the book of life." Chapter 16. The Epistle of Clement. There is extant an epistle of this Clement which is acknowledged to be genuine, and is of considerable length and of remarkable merit. He wrote it in the name of the Church of Rome to the Church of Corinth, when a sedition had arisen in the latter church. We know that this epistle also has been publicly used in a great many churches both in former times and in our own. And of the fact that a sedition did take place in the church of Corinth at the time referred to, Hegesippus is a trustworthy witness. Chapter 17. The Persecution under Domitian. Domitian, having shown great cruelty toward many, and having unjustly put to death no small number of well-born and notable men at Rome, and having without cause exiled and confiscated the property of a great many other illustrious men, finally became a successor of Nero in his hatred and enmity toward God. He was in fact the second that stirred up a persecution against us, although his father Vespasian had undertaken nothing prejudicial to us. Chapter 18. The Apostle John and the Apocalypse. It is said that in this persecution the apostle and evangelist John, who was still alive, was condemned to dwell on the island of Patmos in consequence of his testimony to the divine word. Irenaeus, in the 5th book of his work Against Heresies, where he discusses the number of the name of Antichrist which is given in the so-called Apocalypse of John, speaks as follows concerning him. If it were necessary for his name to be proclaimed openly at the present time, it would have been declared by him who saw the revelation. For it was seen not long ago, but almost in our own generation, at the end of the reign of Domitian. To such a degree, indeed, did the teaching of our faith flourish at that time, that even those writers who were far from our religion did not hesitate to mention in their histories the persecution and the martyrdoms which took place during it. And they, indeed, accurately indicated the time, for they recorded that in the 15th year of Domitian, Flavia Domitilla, daughter of a sister of Flavius Clement, who at that time was one of the consuls of Rome, was exiled with many others to the island of Pontia in consequence of testimony borne to Christ. Chapter 19. Domitian commands the descendants of David to be slain. But when this same Domitian had commanded that the descendants of David should be slain, an ancient tradition says that some of the heretics brought accusation against the descendants of Jude, said to have been a brother of the Saviour according to the flesh, on the ground that they were of the lineage of David and were related to Christ himself. Hegesippus relates these facts in the following words. Chapter 20. The Relatives of our Saviour. Of the family of the Lord there were still living the grandchildren of Jude, who is said to have been the Lord's brother according to the flesh. Information was given that they belonged to the family of David, and they were brought to the Emperor Domitian by the Evocatus. For Domitian feared the coming of Christ as Herod also had feared it. And he asked them if they were descendants of David, and they confessed that they were. Then he asked them how much property they had, or how much money they owned. And both of them answered that they had only 9,000 denarii, half of which belonged to each of them. And this property did not consist of silver, but of a piece of land which contained only 39 acres, and from which they raised their taxes and supported themselves by their own labor. Then they showed their hands, exhibiting the hardness of their bodies and the callousness produced upon their hands by continuous toil, as evidence of their own labor. And when they were asked concerning Christ and his kingdom, of what sort it was, and where and when it was to appear, they answered that it was not a temporal nor an earthly kingdom, but a heavenly and angelic one, which would appear at the end of the world, when he should come in glory to judge the quick and the dead, and to give unto every one according to his works. Upon hearing this, Domitian did not pass judgment against them, but despising them as of no account, he let them go, and by a decree put a stop to the persecution of the church. But when they were released they ruled the churches because they were witnesses and were also relatives of the Lord. And peace being established, they lived until the time of Trajan. These things are related by Hegesippus. Tertullian also has mentioned Domitian in the following words. Domitian also, who possessed a share of Nero's cruelty, attempted once to do the same thing that the latter did. But because he had, I suppose, some intelligence, he very soon ceased, and even recalled those whom he had banished. But after Domitian had reigned 15 years, and Nerva had succeeded to the empire, the Roman Senate, according to the writers that record the history of those days, voted that Domitian's honours should be cancelled, and that those who had been unjustly banished should return to their homes and have their property restored to them. It was at this time that the Apostle John returned from his banishment in the island and took up his abode at Ephesus, according to an ancient Christian tradition. Chapter 21. Surdon becomes the third ruler of the Church of Alexandria. After Nerva had reigned a little more than a year, he was succeeded by Trajan. It was during the first year of his reign that Abilius, who had ruled the Church of Alexandria for 13 years, was succeeded by Surdon. He was the third that presided over that church after Anianus, who was the first. At that time Clement still ruled the Church of Rome, being also the third that held the episcopate there after Paul and Peter. Linus was the first, and after him came Anacletus.